Alright, hello and welcome to ETeeski Tutorials, and you're watching the Ultimate Game Dev Tutorial series. So in our last episode we were introduced to Blender, and we learned a little bit about Blender's layouts and just some of the different windows, how to rearrange the windows and what those windows do, or at least generally. We kind of got into the very basics of things, but today we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, and we're actually going to learn how to start creating some stuff. So we are going to start out a little bit slow, and I don't know, depending on how things go, maybe we'll try to create something that's actually an actual something. But for the most part, I just want to demonstrate to you a couple of tools that you can use, just some really basic tools, just to give you an idea of, well, just some really basic things that you can use to create shapes and create objects. And we're going to learn more and more tools down the line, but I just want to, just introduce to you to how things are made in 3D modeling. And you know, these rules don't only apply to Blender, they also apply to other 3D modeling programs as well, such as Wings 3D or Maya or 3ds Max. You know, those programs, they might have a slightly different interface, and that, you know, their buttons are going to be in different places, and some things might be called something a little bit differently, or there's different keyboard shortcuts and stuff like that. But other than that, I mean, the techniques are going to be very similar. So if you do end up watching any other tutorials besides this one on 3D modeling, and they are using other programs other than Blender, you can still take that information and, you know, those techniques and, you know, try to change their techniques into a way that they will work inside of Blender. Sometimes you'll have to change it up quite a bit. Other times it'll be practically exactly the same, maybe just a different keyboard shortcut. But yeah, that being said, let's start talking about, well, how, you know, how an object or how a 3D mesh gets started, and kind of the idea of how we're going to manipulate it into something that we actually want to bring into our video game. Okay, so once again, the keyboard shortcuts that we learned in the previous episode, I will have those listed or linked below in the description of this video. We learned T to open up the toolbar, and N to open up the properties bar inside of our 3D view. We also learned, what else did we learn? We learned how to use the middle mouse to orbit around. One new one that I want to show you for navigating how you look around in the 3D world. So right now I'm pressing down the middle mouse button, or I'm pressing down the mouse wheel and then moving my mouse to make my camera orbit. I can also use my mouse wheel to zoom in and out. And then one thing you can do is you can hold down Shift and middle mouse, and I can drag around the location of my camera. I can almost drag around the world if I want to see a different part of the world. And those are some basic controls, and we'll get more into more controls that you can use to change the way that you're looking at stuff in our 3D view later. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to create a object or a mesh, because that's the way that most 3D meshes work, and how most 3D artists start off. They first start off with just a simple default 3D mesh, such as a cube, a sphere, maybe like a torus or something like that. There's some basic shapes that most 3D artists will start off as, and then they will manipulate and build off of that 3D shape until they get to their, you know, player character, or a robot, or an alien, or a zombie, or a staircase, or a giant building, or a skyscraper, or I don't know, the list keeps on going on and on, maybe a spaceship, you know, whatever you can imagine. Okay, so how do we bring in a new shape into our scene? Well, first of all, if you remember our 3D cursor, which we can place around using left click, and actually I want to set that right back into the center, and I believe there's more than one way of doing that, but the way that I always do it is I press N to bring up my properties bar over here inside of my 3D view. And I go down here to where it says 3D cursor, and I go 0, tab, 0, tab, 0. and I just set it to 0, 0, 0 on the X, Y, and Z axis so that it moves to the 0, 0, 0 point. And just as a quick refresher about numbers and axes on the X, Y, and Z axis, it's basically like a number line. And as you can see down here, there's a little symbol that helps us orient which way X, Y, and Z is, and they have it color-coded as well. And as you can see, red is X, and there's a red line right there. So at least with the x-axis, you can think of it as a number line, and we have a grid to help us visualize that. And I believe right, or this way, is positive. So this point right here is 0, 0, 0, because that's x, y, and z. And then if we want to move over, we're going to move over 1 on the x-axis. So that's 1 unit right there on the grid. So then it would be 1, 0, 0. Or this point right here would be 2, 0, 0. And then if we wanted to go the opposite way, this would be -1, 0, 0, or -2, 0, 0, and so on and so forth. And then same with the y-axis, which if you're coming into this tutorial series after watching the Unity tutorials, you might remember that the y-axis is up and down in Unity, but in Blender, Z is up and down and Y is forward and back. So just one thing to note and be aware of. But in this case, since we're in Blender, Y is forward and back, which is this green line right here, because Y is green, as you can see there. So if we wanted to move to this point right here, that would be 0, 1, 0, because x-axis is the first number because it goes x, y, z. So if we moved to this point, it would be 0, 1, 0. If we moved over to this point, it would be 1, 1, 0, because we are 1 on the x-axis and 1 on the y-axis, which if we go over this way and then over this way, we're at 1, 1, 0. And then if we wanted to move upwards from there, we can move 1 on the z-axis, and it would be 1, 1, 1. Or if we wanted to move a little higher, it'd be 1, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. And that's how you get positions in 3D space. So that's just one thing I just wanted to absolutely make sure that you understood as we move forward from here on out. Because when it comes to creating stuff in 3D space, you know, these are art tutorials. We are creating 3D art. But you do need a minimal understanding of 3D space and how these numbers are going to work, and a little bit of geometry. It's not necessarily like geometry that you will learn in school, where it's just boring and you're writing down on a piece of paper like x plus y divided by 2 equals 3 point. You don't like, it's not boring like that. It's much more visual when we're inside of Blender. It's still geometry, but at least you can see it happening in front of your eyes. And, you know, when you're done and you figure out this geometry and figure out the geometry that you need to accomplish something, well, then you are creating something awesome in the process. Unlike, you know, if you're just doing a test or a quiz in school, it's just boring. It's just numbers on a piece of paper. Like, why is that even useful? It's just so boring. But in Blender, or in any 3D modeling, it's much more exciting because geometry actually creates stuff. And it's going to be geometry in 3D space. So that's why we need to understand X, Y, and Z. So it's not too complicated. It's just a 3D grid. And the 3 numbers determine a point in 3D space. And we can also use similar numbers to get rotations and scales. But we'll talk more about that later. Not nearly as complicated as it sounds. Okay, so let me get back to what I was talking about. We need to create a shape that we can then manipulate into actually looking like something. Okay, so there's 2 ways that we can create a mesh or an object, or I believe those objects have a mesh on them, technically is what's going on, but don't worry about that. Basically, we're going to create something, and then we're going to manipulate that something into something that we want. That's the simplest way that I can describe it. So there's 2 ways that we can do that. We can go to down here on this little menu down here that is on the 3D view. And remember from our previous tutorial, we used to have a number line or a timeline down here. So your version of Blender might look a little bit more like this. But and if that's the case, then this is the menu that you want to be looking at because it's at the bottom of the 3D view. And then this menu down here is the timeline menu, and we're not going to be using that, at least not for a while. We're going to leave that alone. And in fact, I don't even want it there. So I'm going to drag this corner right here, and I'm going to drag from this corner into this window to make this window take over this window and just get rid of this window. So I'm going to do that like that, and you see the little gray arrow, and then I'm going to let go of left click, and then bam, there we go. So now we have a nice big view of what we're going to be editing. So let's go down to add, and then we can go to mesh, and you can see there's a bunch of other things that we can add. We can add a camera, a light, but for our purposes, since we're learning how to make video games, we're just going to be taking our 3D models and putting them into our video game. So we're going to handle the cameras and the lights inside of Unity3D, or our video game engine. So go ahead and ignore that for now, unless you want to play around with it. No, nothing wrong with that. But let's add a mesh. And yeah, there's a bunch of different things that we can add, but we want to add a mesh, at least for this tutorial. And as you can see, we have a whole bunch of shapes that we can choose from. So these are going to be our starting points. So we can basically look at all of these different shapes and say, okay, you know, depending on what we're making, you know, one of these might be closer to what we want. Like, let's say we're modeling a can of soda, or maybe a can of tomato sauce or something like that. Well, we might want a cylinder because that's very close to what we want. Like if we were making a can of soda, like a can of Coca-Cola or Sprite, or if you're me and you live in Michigan, we call it pop, but apparently that's weird. That, I mean, it sounds normal to me, but anyways, that's a completely side note. So let's say we're modeling a can of soda or Coca-Cola or something. Well, this is almost exactly what we need, except there's just a few more details that we need to add. We just need to add some little ridges around the inside of this line, then add a little pop tab for opening up your can of soda. So this can be a starting point. And I'm going to press Control Z, and I'm going to show you some other objects that we can start off with. If I go down to Mesh, Cube is very, very common. I start off almost all my models with a cube, or a box is really probably a more common name for this type of shape, but technically it's called a cube. But anyways, so you know, a cube might be good. Like if I wanted to model a refrigerator or a TV, or anything that kind of has a boxy square shape to it, or if I want to model a cardboard box, well, then starting off with a cube would, you know, just accelerate, you know, it would just give us a better starting point for creating what we want to create. I'm going to hit, or I can either hit Control Z to go back, or let me add that again so that I can show you another way that we can get rid of it, or I can select it and I can press the Delete key. And on your keyboard, that's the DEL key, which is located next to Insert, Home, and Page Up, Page Down. So different from your backspace key. This is the DEL, or the Delete key. So I'm going to select Delete, and I got rid of it. And now let's take a look at another way that we can add meshes into our scene. So that's the first way. You go to Add, Mesh, and then there are all of your options. But another way that we can do that is we can go into our toolbar. And to go into our toolbar, we can either click on this little plus symbol right there, or we can hit the key T, and that will toggle it on and off whether or not we see it. So if we want more room to see what we're doing, we can hit T to get rid of it, or we can hit T if, you know, there's something in here that we want to quickly grab. Let's see, what are some other things that we can make? We could manipulate this into an ice cream cone if we want to make an ice cream cone. I don't know, apparently Blender likes to have a monkey in here, so if you want to make a monkey, well, you have the head. Now all you need to do is make a body. So I guess that's kind of just like a joke thing to add in there, just something to experiment around with. So a lot of times in Blender, or if you look up Blender online, you will see this monkey all over the place. And well, that's why, because it's just one of the default shapes for, I guess, just experimenting around with. Lastly, we have a sphere. And I guess there's a couple other objects such as a torus, which let me delete the sphere so that you can see the torus a little bit better. So if we were to model a donut, well, this would be really useful. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to show you one other thing when it comes to creating these objects over here. And I can't remember if there's any settings for the cube, but I know there are for the sphere. So let's take the sphere. And before I click on anything else, so I created the sphere, it created itself where our 3D cursor is located. So if I moved my 3D cursor over there, it would have been created over there. If I moved over there, it would have been created over there. And that's why I set it to, where is it? Our 3D cursor, there it is. That's why I set it to 0, 0, 0 inside of our, is this properties? Or is it, yeah, I believe it's called the properties bar. I don't know, at least that's what I've been calling it. It might be actually called something else. But anyways, before you click on anything else, we have some options about our add UV sphere. Or actually, I don't know why it's called UV sphere for some reason. I guess that's just the, I don't know why it says UV. Well, whatever, it's our sphere. So we have some options as soon as we add it. And I'll just demonstrate this before I play around with these options. If I were to move this, my options went away. I no longer have those options there. So you need to do those options as soon as you create it and before you do anything with it. So if I hit Control Z, yeah, my options are still gone. So in this case, I'm going to delete the sphere. And I'm going to, well, I guess for demonstration purposes, I'll spawn my sphere over there on my 3D cursor. See my 3D cursor? It's floating around in 3D space. That's that little thing. It kind of looks like one of those safety life, not raft, one of those safety flotation devices on a boat. But anyways, that's our 3D cursor, and our sphere is going to spawn right there. And you'll see when I click here, UV sphere, it spawned right there. So there we go. And I am going to change some options about it. We have some options. We can change the size. We can change the rings, and if you look really closely, that's basically how much detail is in our sphere. Because that's one thing about 3D meshes inside of video games, is that really there's nothing in the video game that's ever perfectly round. That's kind of a misconception. So if you're playing a video game, and let's say you see a barrel or a basketball, or, you know, any video game that you're playing and you see a round object and it looks round, but the reason why it looks round is because it has a bunch of smaller, and if you see, I'll zoom in so that maybe you can see it a little bit better. I'm going to hold down Shift and middle mouse, and then I can move it into my view. So as you can see, the more I increase this number, the more detail we get, or the more little segments we get. And we can also do this with those vertical segments, just like that. So we can make it really simple, or we can make it have a lot of detail. And the more detail you add to it, well, arguably it will look better because it has more polygons in it. It has more points in 3D spaces. It has more faces. So it, you know, will have more detail and might look a little bit more realistic. But the problem is if we add too much, our game is going to run slow because the computer has to render everything that we make every single frame. So if your computer is running at 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, it has to do that, you know, 30 times a second or 60 times a second, or, you know, upwards to 120 times a second. So it has to keep on doing that over and over again. So the more we add to it, the slower our computer is going to run. The more our computer has to think about it. So we want to make the job easy for the computer so our computer can run fast, and therefore our game is going to run smooth. And that's what we want. We want a smooth experience for our player. So that's why we don't want to add too much detail. And this is something I'm going to talk about later, but that's just something I want you to keep in mind, is don't add too much detail, otherwise your computer is going to slow down. So yeah, we can change that. We can add very little detail. We can make it like that, and now it looks something more like on an N64 or a Sega Dreamcast or one of those older video game consoles when the computers weren't as powerful and they had less polygons that they could play with. But I'm going to increase that to a number that is a good balance point between looking good but not being too many. And because we're on a modern computer, we can totally get away with, that many. Like, it looks like there's lots and lots and lots of squares, and that's a lot for us people to think about, but computers are pretty fast nowadays, so it can easily handle that many squares that, all form together to make our circle or our sphere. So yeah, those are three options that we can play around with spheres. And now when I say move this or edit it in some way, our options are gone. So we have to pick and choose that from the beginning and make sure that's what we want from the beginning when we're making a new shape. I guess before I move on, let's take a look just really quickly. I'm going to press Control Z a few times. There we go. Now it's gone. Let's see if Cube has any options. I guess Cube doesn't have many options. You can just change the radius, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I thought radius was something for a circle, but apparently Blender thinks that radius is something that you can also use for a cube. But that's basically just changing the size of our cube. And one thing to note, like let's say that you are moving ahead of me and you're learning some things that I haven't taught yet in this tutorial series, and you know about the S key for changing the size of something. Well, that is a pretty simple tool, and that's something I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, about how you can change the size of something. But one thing I want to tell you is that when we're making video games, it tends to work a whole lot better if you change the size only when we're in edit mode. So if this says edit mode, feel free to resize something. But if we are in object mode, I would refrain from changing the size of something. It just tends to work better once we get into our video game engine. So since I did that, I'm going to delete that. And just to show you one more time, the better way to change this is either keep it as it is and then go into edit mode and then resize it, or when you first create it, you can change the size of it right here. And for a cube, that's the only option that we have when we first create the cube. I'm going to delete that cube and see what else we have. Like, let's just give one more example. So a torus, let's see. I guess I have to scroll down here. I'm going to move that up so that I can see. Okay. So I guess torus gives us more options. For some reason, I guess this one gives us a location and rotation. I don't know why it gives us it on this shape, but not the other shapes. It's a little bit strange. I don't really understand. But as you can see, we do have options down here. Like we have a radius that we can change. So if we want to change the major radius, and if you don't know what it is, play around with it and see what it does. Okay, so that's like how big the circle is. And then our minor radius, I'm guessing that's how thick this is. So let's say we were modeling a donut. I'm guessing we want to make this number bigger because donuts aren't skinny like that. They're a little bit thicker. So let's change this, and yep, there we go. Now it looks a little bit more like a donut. But, let's say we're making a really high detail game, and we're like, that donut needs more detail. Like, these segments, like, if you look over at the corner, it's like donuts don't have corners like that. So let's add a few more segments. So I believe we can just go to minor segments, and whoops. I guess you can either click on that number manually and type in whatever number you want, like let's say 30, and hit enter. And there we go, it changed it. Or we can click on it and we can drag it, and we can adjust the value there, and we can just look at it visually and say, that's what I want. That's the number of segments that I want. But then let's say that, if you're looking from the top, you're like, okay, these outer segments, there's a lot of those, and there's probably more than we need. And the computer might run slow if we have that many. So we can, where am I? Okay, our major segments. So we can drag that down a little. And then let's say like, there's a good point where it doesn't look too boxy, but there's also not too many. And I might want to lower that a little bit too. And then, there we go. There's a good starting point for our donuts. But yeah, so that is how to, I'm going to delete that and I'm going to start over again. And I'm actually going to set my 3D cursor back to the center. So 0, tab, 0, tab, 0. There we go. I'm going to hit N to get that out of my way. And let's start new. Because now that I showed you a little bit about where our starting point is going to be, I want to show you, once you pick a shape that's somewhat close to what we're trying to create, I'm going to show you now how to manipulate that shape. So for example, let's take a cube. I guess that's cube is good the way it is, because really the only thing we can adjust is the size of it, and in this case, for this example, I guess it really doesn't matter too much. But what I am going to do is I'm going to press T to get that toolbar out of our way so that we have more, just more room to see what we're working on. And one little trick I want to show you right now is press the period key on your number pad. So it's on the right hand side of your keyboard next to the number pad that looks kind of like a calculator or something. Press the period key, or at least on my keyboard it says period and DEL for delete. So I guess depending on whether or not your number pad or your num lock key is on, so on the top left hand corner of your num lock, I don't know why on the screen it says none. That's not like the key I'm pressing. But yeah, just make sure your num lock is on. That's in the top left hand corner of your number pad, the part of your keyboard that looks like a calculator. Just click on it until, most keyboards have a little light on them that will determine whether or not your caps lock or your num lock is on. So you just want to turn your num lock on so that those numbers show up onto your computer, if that makes sense. Basically, if you're pressing the buttons on your number pad and it's not working, try pressing the num lock button and then press those numbers again and then see if they're working. So just a little problem solving thing in case you run into that problem. But anyways, what I was saying about your number pad and pressing the period key on it, like let's say, my camera is, I'm looking over here and I want to look over this box. I'm having trouble getting to where I want to go. One nice trick that will really help you out is just press the period key and then our computer will zoom in to whatever we have highlighted. And then we can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and we can still orbit by pressing the middle mouse button, and we can drag our view by holding shift and middle mouse. I don't know why sometimes down there that little thing that's supposed to be showing you what keys I'm pressing, sometimes it doesn't show you all the keys that I'm pressing. So I'm going to try to say out loud what keys I'm pressing as I'm doing this stuff. But yeah, just bear that in mind. Okay, so here we go. We have this, and I guess before I jump into edit mode, I just want to quickly show you what happens if you don't have this selected. So I'm going to press A to deselect. So that's one keyboard shortcut. And I wonder if there's another way. I think I can also go to select and probably, is there like a select all? Oh, there we go. Deselect / select all, A key right there. But it's a lot faster to just use the keyboard shortcut. So the A key will have you go back and forth between deselect and select all. So let me throw in another shape in here just as an example. So we have a cube and a sphere. And press T to get that out of our way. And I can select between these two by right-clicking on them. So remember, we learned that in the last episode. We can left-click is to move your 3D cursor. Right-click is to select. So it's a little bit backwards from what you might be used to. And we can select between those two. Whoops. Also, if you right-click and you drag, you can move stuff around, and you can either press left-click to place it, or you can press right-click to cancel the move. But if I wanted to, I could put it over there. It doesn't really make a difference because this is just an example. But anyways, I can select between the two, and if I want to select both of them, there's a couple different ways I can do that. I can hold down Shift and then right-click. Also, it didn't show up down there. I don't know why it does that sometimes. But anyways, I can press Shift and then I can right-click to select multiple objects. And then the other way that I can do it is I can press A, and it will select everything in here. So I guess why don't I go ahead and create one more shape in here, and I can also drag these arrows to move stuff around, and we're going to learn more about that in just a second in this tutorial. So once again, if I hold down Shift, I can click on that and I can just add whatever I want to select. And then I can also select something, and you can see the last thing that you've selected has a slightly lighter orange outline. See how these have a darker orange outline? The last thing you've selected has a lighter orange outline. So if I hold down Shift and I click on that one, now this is my most recently selected just 3D object, I guess. And if I want to deselect something, I can hold down Shift and right click on it again, and it will go away. So if I want to do that, say I want to unselect this cylinder, I can hold down Shift, right click on it, and now it's my most recently selected object, and then hold down Shift and right click again, and now it's deselected. And there we go, now we only have this one still selected. So yeah, that's a little crash course on how to select things. So you can press A and then A again to deselect. So A is really useful, and the more you use Blender, I bet you that your finger is going to be hovering over the A key almost all the time because it's just so commonly used, just the more you use Blender. Okay, so I guess I will keep these game objects in here just to continue to show you what happens when you go into edit mode. So I'm going to select our cube by right-clicking on it, and then I'm going to go into edit mode. Now there's two ways that I can go into edit mode. I can click down here and go to edit mode, or I can just hit tab. And tab will switch you back and forth between edit mode and object mode. And but more technically, the tab button actually switches you back and forth between the two most recent modes you had selected. So let's say I actually went into weight paint mode, and you can see it's turned blue because we're in weight paint mode. But if I hit tab now, it goes back to edit mode, and then it toggles between weight paint mode and edit mode because those are my two most recent modes that I was in. So what I can do is I can go to my object mode, and if I hit tab again, then I'm going back and forth between edit mode and object mode. So yeah, if you're hitting tab and you're going back and forth between the wrong modes, just go to object mode, then go to edit mode, and then hit tab, 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 and then you should be able to switch back and forth between the two very easily. Okay, so now let's go into edit mode and learn about edit mode. So edit mode will make you go in and you'll edit whatever object that you had selected, and you'll still see the sphere and the cylinder over there, but if I right click on them right now, nothing is happening because I'm in edit mode. I'm editing my cube right here. And also I can press A and I can deselect the cube. But now when I go to try to select the cube, I'm not selecting just the cube, I'm actually selecting little points on the cube. These are what are known as vertices, or vertex. I believe vertex is the singular way you say it, and vertices, or vertice, I don't know, is the plural way of saying the word. So basically a point in 3D space that makes up a 3D shape or a 3D object is called a vertice or a vertex. Sometimes they go by slightly different words and people call them slightly different things. So anyways, that's a vertex. So that's one thing that makes up a 3D shape. The other two things are lines and faces. And in order to go back and forth between selecting vertices and lines and faces, we're going to use these buttons down here. And you can see they're pretty clearly labeled. We have a little square with a point to demonstrate that, you know, this is how we select a vertex. And you can see that little pop-up thing that's trying to help me out says vertex. Now if we want to select a line, we can go over here to where there's a little picture of a line selected. So I'm going to click on that. And now when I click on things, it's selecting lines. And just like with the objects when we were in object mode, we can hold down Shift and we can select more than one. And then the last thing is face. So you click on there and that's a face. and we can select faces. And once again, we can hold down Shift and we can select them just like that. And one cool thing, if we go to a face and then we select vertice mode, it's going to have these 4 vertices selected, because those 4 vertices were what were making up the face. And then the lines connect the lines around that face, and then the face itself is the face. It's like the actual part that you see. Okay, so we got that down. We learned that we can select the different parts that make up a 3D shape, which are vertices, lines, and faces, and we learned that we can select those independently on whatever object that we are editing. In this case, the cube. If we want to edit, say, the sphere now, we can press Tab to go back into object mode, select our sphere, and then press Tab again, and now you can see we are editing the sphere, and the sphere has a lot of vertices. And we can also select the lines. There's a lot of lines, and we can select faces and all of that. Okay, so that's how to select the different parts that make up a 3D object. So now how do we edit those? Well, the first part is that we can move any of these parts around independently, and everything else is going to stretch to move along with it. So let's take, for example, I'm going to actually press period on my number pad. You can see number pad period to zoom in on what I have selected so that you can see it better. And let's say I want to move this, and I want these shapes to stretch along with it because they're connected to it. So they're going to stretch to it because they're still connected to it. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. So there's 2 ways that we can move this around. Well, actually there's 3 ways. The first way, remember I talked about how you can hold down right click and you can drag, and now you can see I'm stretching this away from the object. Or I can go this way and I can go inside of the object. And then I can either hit left click to set it down. I'm going to hit Control Z to show you that again. If I drag this, I clicked right click and I dragged it before I let go of right click. And then when I let go of right click, now you can see it's stuck to my mouse, and it's going to stay stuck there until I hit either left click or right click. And if I hit right click, it's cancel. So if I do that again, left click is deploy or set or do or whatever word you want to use. It, accomplishes, or I don't know. It sets it. Let's use that word. So that's one way that we can move it. We can also drag these arrows around. That's one nice thing that keeps things simple. So I go back and forth between the 3 different methods. I will sometimes be lazy and I'll just drag one of these arrows. Like let's say I know I want to move it just on the x-axis or on this red line. So I'm going to drag it like that. And all you need to do is, just grab it, and I'm holding down left click, and then when I let go of left click, it lands just like that. So that's another way that we can do it, and that's probably one of the most simple, most intuitive ways that, we have this little graphical thing that shows us what direction it's going to be pulled in. So that's one of the simplest ways to do it. Okay, so the 2 ways that we've talked about so far, you drag your left click. I don't know what did that say there? Erverted tweaker? I don't know what that even means. Okay, but anyways, I clicked on it with right click and then drag, and then that's a way I can move it. And if I want to cancel it, right click or left click to deploy it. Or if I want to move it with the arrows, I just drag it and let go, drag it and let go. And I'm using left click for that. Okay, so those are the first 2 ways. And now the third way is a keyboard shortcut that I want to show you. And that's the keyboard shortcut for it is G. And I like to remember that as the grab tool. It's like I'm grabbing it and then moving it. So I'm going to hit G, and it's going to grab whatever I have selected. And it's going to move it around just relative to my mouse. And just like when I drag it with right click, I can either hit left click to deploy it or right click to cancel. And that was a right click. So I'm going to hit G again and then left click. And that is a way that I can do that. So remember, G is the move tool. And to remember that, G is grab. So your mouse can either be on whatever you have selected, or it can be away from it. Like, let's say my mouse is over here. I can hit G, and it's just going to move relative to my mouse. And one nice thing that Blender does is it makes your mouse wrap around the corner of your screen, kind of like Pac-Man. You know, that's just a nice way of making sure you don't lose sight of where your mouse is. And then I'll hit right click, because that's not quite where I want it to land. So that's how to do that with G key. And one thing that we can do with G key, remember with these arrows, when we drag these arrows around, see how it locks to one of the axes, or the X, Y, or Z axis, depending on which arrow we grab? We can do something very similar with the G key as well, or the grab tool. So I'm going to hit G, and now we're free floating. So our, you know, we basically are just moving it around according to where our perspective is, where we are looking in our 3D view. But if I hit either X, Y, or Z, like let's say I want it to stick to that red line, the X axis, as you can see down here in the corner where there's a little red line and it says X. It's really small and hard to see probably on the screen recording. But let's say I want to move it, I want to lock it into that direction. All I need to do is hit X while my G, or my grab tool, is moving it around. And now it will lock it to the X axis. And then I can move it around and I can hit left click to deploy it, or right click to cancel. But let's say, you know, I grab it and I'm like, wait, I didn't want the X axis. I meant the Z axis. I want it to go up and down. I can now hit Z and it will switch to the Z axis and say like, oh, wait, maybe X was what I wanted. And I can hit, whoops, I hit the wrong key, hit X. And there we go, it's locking to the X axis. And then also just like X and Z, I can also press Y and it will lock to the Y axis. So I'm going to deploy that just like that. So those are the three ways of moving shapes around. And if I hit tab and go back into object mode, you'll see that those three methods work exactly the same. I can drag those arrows around. I can drag with right click. And I believe with right click, once you drag, you can also hit X or Y or Z. And also the G key works just the same. So that's a nice thing about Blender, is a lot of stuff is universal. A lot of the keyboard shortcuts work just the same as they do in 3D space, as they do in other parts of Blender. And that's something that you'll see as time goes on. So that's something about, remember in the last episode when I talked about how there are so many keyboard shortcuts, and here I listed as many as I could. And how there are so many keyboard shortcuts. Well, a nice thing is that a lot of the keyboard shortcuts are very universal and they work the same way in different places. So anyways, let's go back to edit mode. I'm going to hit tab to go into edit mode. And I just want to quickly demonstrate that the line tool and vertex tool work the same way. I can hit G and I can move this stuff around, and you know, it's the exact same controls. If I move it over there, then it's starting to get confused because I'm really tearing this thing apart. So I'm going to move that back. I'm actually going to grab my face tool and I'm going to move that closer to there. Oh wait, whoop, the view's a little skewed. Sometimes you got to move your view in different directions. There we go, that's a little closer to what I wanted. Well, really I'm just messing around, so there's really nothing specific that I want. But anyways, and then I'll show you that the vertice tool works just the same. I just hit the G key and I can move it around. And also we can do this with multiple items selected, whether those are vertices or faces or objects. I can select, you know, they don't all have to be in the same place. I can kind of select them randomly like that if I really wanted to. And if I hit G, I can move them around. I can hit Z to lock them to the Z axis, and all of the other stuff that we just talked about. They work just the same, pretty much no matter what you're selecting. And you know, just experiment around with it. And it's one of those things that might be a little bit hard to put into words, but once you experiment around with it, it just starts to make sense inside of your own brain. It's kind of just one of those things. It's like riding a bike. You can't really explain what it's like to ride a bike to somebody. You just got to tell them to ride a bike, and then it's weird at first, but then, you know, they start riding it, and then, you know, eventually it just makes sense and you don't have to think about it anymore. I know I'm probably going to use that riding a bike analogy many, many times throughout this tutorial series, but Blender is just like that. Okay, so now that we talked about the G key, now let's talk about R and S, because those are also very useful. And those two keys are short for rotate and scale. So let's first talk about rotate. And just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use the cube. I'm going to press numpad period to zoom in on it so that I can see it better. And I'm going to show you how you can rotate things. So let's take this cube, for example. Let's start with a face. I'll select this top face, and let's say I want to rotate it. I can just press R, and I can rotate it. So now it's spinning around. And I can do that with the object itself when I'm in, oops, let me hit tab, object mode, as you can see down here. If I hit R, it rotates the entire thing, or it rotates whatever I have selected. And in this case, I have the object selected, so the object's going to rotate around. But that's something I prefer to do inside of edit mode, just because it makes it easier for us when we go inside of Unity, when we import our 3D shapes that we've created, when we import our meshes into Unity. It's better when you do all of your editing, such as, such as scale and rotation. If you just edit those in Unity, it just tends to work better, and we'll talk about that later. I guess if you do that now, it's not that big of a deal. We'll learn more about it later. So anyways, so if I do want to rotate this whole cube inside of edit mode as opposed to object mode, I can hit A. So I actually hit A twice because I had that selected and it deselects it. So now that I have nothing selected, I'm going to hit select again, and then it selects everything. So if you want to select everything, you can just hit AA, or just keep on hitting A until you get to what you want. So it just toggles between deselect and select all. So now that I have everything selected, I can hit R again, and I can rotate everything, and it all rotates together. Or I can select just those two faces, and I can just rotate those, and then the other parts of our cube are going to stay where they are, and just stretch to accommodate our new rotation. See how, well, that kind of screwed it up when I moved my mouse over there, but see how that point right over there isn't moving? It's staying stationary, and the lines that connect that point to the other parts of the cube that I'm rotating are stretching to accommodate how the other parts are changing. And that's because they're connected with lines and faces. Okay, so that's one way that we can rotate something. But let's say that we just want to rotate the top of our cube, and we just want to make the bottom of it kind of twist to go. So we want like this bottom to stay here, and we want to rotate this 90 degrees so that our box kind of twists. So that means that we want to rotate the top of our box this way, right? We kind of want to rotate it, horizontally, kind of like it's trying to think of an analogy. I don't know, it's just going to rotate horizontally. You'll see what I mean in a second. But when I hit the R key, well, it's rotating, but not quite in the way that we want. Let me hit Control Z. If we did want it to rotate that way, there's two different ways we can do that. We can either move our camera so that we're looking straight up and down on it, or as close as we can get, and then we can hit R, and then it's going to rotate according to where the camera is. I'm going to hit right click to cancel that. But the better way to do it, the more accurate way to do it, is to actually hit R. So now we're rotating, and just like with the G key, we can hit X, Y, or Z to lock it to those axes. So if we want it to move that way, we're actually going to lock it to the Z axis. And now you can see when I'm rotating the key and moving it like that, now our box is twisting. And to remember which way something is going to rotate when you're hitting the X, Y, or Z axis, just imagine, see how it highlights the Z line right there? Actually, I'm going to right click because that's starting to get weird. And then let me R, and then I hit Z. So see how that blue line appeared? And blue is Z, as you can see in this little little symbol down here. Blue is Z, or up and down. So that line is there. So whatever we're rotating, when we're rotating something, it's going to rotate around that line, kind of like the axle of a wheel. So that's what it means when you rotate around an axis. So I'm going to hit right click, and let's say I want to rotate this one in a similar way. And let's say, I want to rotate it around that way. You probably can't really tell what I'm trying to say with the mouse, so I'll just show you. If I hit R, well, if I don't press any keys besides just R, it's going to rotate according to which way my view is pointing, or the camera of our 3D view. But, like before, like let's say if I hit Z, I want to lock it to Z. Well, it's rotating around the Z axis like an axle, like the axle of a wheel. Or, if you imagine sticking a toothpick in, let's say, yeah, just imagine that you stick a toothpick in something and then you roll that toothpick between your fingers. That is the axis that you're rotating around. So the toothpick would be the axis. So that's another analogy that I like to use to explain it. So either a toothpick or the axle of a wheel, like the wheel of a car or the wheel of a wagon or something like that. And, let's say I want to set it like that. I can either hit left click and put it right there if that's what I wanted. Or, if I want to rotate it around the x-axis to get that twisting motion, kind of like we did on the top of the cube, I can hit X to switch what axis I'm rotating around. And, if I change my mind again, I can also do Y. I can go back to Z. Or I can hit X again. So now you can see I'm rotating around the x-axis. So there we go. Those are some tools that we can use to modify our shape. And then the last one that I want to show you that goes hand in hand with the grab or move tool and the rotate tool is the scale tool. And what keyboard shortcut is the scale tool? You guessed it, it is S. Because, S, scale, it's pretty easy to remember. And it's very easy to understand what scale does. It just makes something bigger or smaller. You're just resizing it to a different size. And we don't have to resize it uniformly like that. Like, maybe we do want to do that, or maybe we want to scale it down because we're making a pyramid, kind of like in Egypt or something like that. Maybe it would look a little bit more like that. There's our Egyptian pyramid or something. But, let's say that's not quite what we wanted to do. We wanted to, stretch this top part. We want to stretch it longer. And, if we want to stretch it that way, well, that direction is the x-axis, as you can see, because it's red, and then red is x. So I'm going to hit S, and then X, and then I can scale it just like the other tools on a single axis. And then I can switch back and forth. I can do the y-axis, and my mouse cursor wraps around the screen like Pac-Man. And then I can also, hit SZ. And, well, it doesn't work in this case because, well, that part is kind of, well, it's just flat. So if I try to scale it on the Z-axis, well, it's not going to scale very much because how much, bigger can you get than just flat? Like, it's not going to make that thicker because it's a face. If we wanted it to appear thicker or anything along those lines, we would just move it or something along those lines. And there's other tools that we can use for moving stuff around and creating different shapes for what we want. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode. And let's see, what was, I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I get everything in this episode that I wanted to. In the next episode, we're going to learn about other tools for creating more geometry. Because right now you can see we still, this is still a cube. It still has 6 sides to it, kind of like the sides of a dice. We changed the shape of them, but they're all still, it's the same number of shapes. So let's say we wanted to add more. Well, we're going to learn that in the next episode. So say extrude, we hit E, and, we can bring stuff out like that. So that's the extrude tool. So we can use that to create more geometry. And there's other tools such as inset, which is I, but we're going to learn about those in the next episode, and I'm going to go through a couple of basic ones just to get a couple of tools under your belt that you can use. And then one last thing I want to say is that here's my keyboard shortcuts. These, we didn't go over all of these yet, but there's some of them, like there's rotate, scale, grab, save, select. There's quite a few different keyboard shortcuts there. And chances are, especially when you're first starting off and, later down the line as well, you're going to forget some of those, and it's going to be hard to remember what all of the keyboard shortcuts are. And, maybe you'll remember the name of a tool. Like, let's take, for example, the tool bevel. Maybe you remember what it's called, or maybe you've heard about it, but you just don't know the keyboard shortcut yet. And bevel is something where you take a line and it kind of flattens it out. Like here, I know the keyboard shortcut of it. It's Control B, and then I can do that. And, that's what bevel does. But let's say that I forgot that. How do I find it? Well, Blender has a very nice little tool, and all you need to do is press spacebar. And now you can search for stuff. Like, let's take, for example, bevel. If I type in B-E-V-E-L, there we go, bevel. There it is, Control B. And I can also select it and just use it that way. So that's another really nice thing that you can use in Blender if you forget the keyboard shortcuts. Or you can go on Google, and if you just Google search something such along the lines of like, Blender bevel or Blender 3D bevel. Most of the time, if you know the name of the tool you're trying to get, or you're calling it something that's close to what it's actually named, you can Google search it. And because Blender has a really great online community, and people are always talking about Blender on the internet and sharing information and posting on forums and tutorials, and there's a lot of actual official documentation on Blender on blender.org. If you Google search it, within the first 2 results, maybe the first 2 or 3 results in the search results when you Google this, you'll get what you're looking for, or you'll find a page that explains it. So if you don't know something, Google search it. Or if you just forget the keyboard shortcut, you can either press spacebar to search it inside of Blender, or you can go online and search it that way. And usually it's pretty easy to find what you're looking for. So yeah, I think that's everything I want to go over in this tutorial. So feel free to mess around with all of the tools that I've talked about, and resizing things, and creating different shapes, and going back and forth between object mode and edit mode, and just continue to familiarize yourself with all of these different shapes. One exercise you could do is maybe try building, kind of like a block castle or a block building. Like, remember when you have little building blocks when you're a kid, and you have blocks that are squares, blocks that are triangles, and you stack them together to create like a castle or something like that? Try doing that. Try creating a bunch of different shapes, and you can move them around, and then you can also go into those shapes into edit mode, and you can change them around by selecting the lines or the faces and the vertices, and see if you can build something. Just mess around with Blender, and just see what you can build. And of course, don't forget to save it when you when you're done with it and you create something cool. That keyboard shortcut was Control S, and it went into this window because I haven't saved this yet. And I can also do Control Shift S for save as, and Control O for open. We covered that in the previous tutorial, and I'm gonna rename this one to I don't know, basic shapes example. Whatever, I'll probably delete that later because I'm just using this as an example just for educational purposes. So yeah, that was a little bit more information about how to use Blender. So feel free to experiment around with those, and once you feel ready, once you feel a little bit more comfortable moving around in Blender and using these tools, move on to the next episode, and we're going to learn more about some tools for creating geometry, and maybe we'll try to create a little something. And once we do that, then we will move into Unity and actually learn how to bring these shapes into Unity and figure out what that process is like, because that's our ultimate goal in this Ultimate Game Dev tutorial series, is that we want to create these shapes and these objects and these eventually we're going to get more complicated and we're going to create characters, and we eventually want to bring these into our video game. And in the case of this tutorial series, we're going to bring them into the video game engine Unity3D. So we're going to do that in a little bit. And even if you're just learning just the art side of video games and you only want to be an artist within video games and you really don't care about writing code, and that's really cool. That's super important in video games. You need your programmers and you need your artists. But I'm a firm believer that you should be at least a little bit familiar with both. So, in these art tutorials, I am going to show a little bit about how to use Unity3D, and then feel free to jump around to my other Unity3D tutorials as well to become a little bit more familiar with how Unity3D works. In case you haven't heard of Unity3D yet, Unity3D, just go to unity3d.com, and it is a free program, and it's really great for creating video games, and a lot of people use it to create video games. So if you collaborate with a programmer or a video game coder, there's a good chance they're going to be using Unity3D if they're creating a 3D video game. Some other ones are like the Unreal Engine or the Frostbite engine, or there's other options available out there as well, but in this case we're going to be using Unity3D because it's very common and it would be very good to learn even if you are an artist and you only want to focus on the art side, because if you learn just a little bit about what it's like to be a programmer and program in Unity3D, or at least learn what the interface of the Unity3D engine is like, you can create better artwork for the programmers so that it's easier for them to take your artwork and put it into the video game that you are creating together. So yeah, that was my little blurb about learn both at least a little bit of both sides of art and programming, no matter which one you choose to focus on. Most people tend to choose one or the other. I just think it's important to learn both, and then choose which one you want to do. For example, for me, I have learned, I know, a good handful about 3D artwork, but honestly, if I had to choose one or the other, I am a programmer. I love writing code and I love creating the rules of a game and how that video game works. So yeah, that's enough of me talking. I'm going to move on. We can move on to our next episode. This tutorial is really long. So I guess until the next episode, I will see you later, and keep making games.